To begin with, it is a great privilege to deliver the third Fage lecture. Fage was a man I knew and worked in the same department as him for many years. And I remember him as a man of great elegance of manners. He was really an elegant, he moved in a beautiful way. And his absence of pomposity. I have never seen a man more devoid of pomposity than John Fage. And at the same time, he was full of energy, which he devoted to the service of the African Studies community. Working alone and working with Roland Oliver of SOAS, he took seminal steps like co-founding the Journal of African History and co-editing the Cambridge History of Africa. And he was, of course, the founder of our department and the man who guided it for many, many years. So it is for me really an honor and a privilege to deliver this lecture in his honor. One of the things he was very careful about was to avoid publishing studies if he thought they were not sufficiently based on empirical research, on field work and case studies done in different parts of Africa. He took steps to prevent, actually, the Cambridge History of Africa to begin to be organized and published until he felt it was possible to do it. So his emphasis on field work and case studies was very strong. And I am also grateful to him and my colleagues at QAS, at our Center of West African Studies, OR, because he always supported our field work in every way accessible to him. At the same time, he also said that once one felt a certain limit had been passed and there was enough empirical material available, it was time to draw wide pictures. So today, this is what I'm trying to do. It is a madly wide picture which deals not with inscriptions, but with orality, and with something that is not usually much talked about, which is Muslim orality, which tends to have a bad reputation as something Muslims did in Africa when there was not enough knowledge of Islam available in the continent. And I'm talking specifically of West Africa. On the other hand, Muslim traditions in general are sometimes described by people who like to think of a pure original Africa, uncontaminated by any form of foreign culture, as something alien, not really part of African tradition. And what I'm trying to suggest today, is that both these attitudes are wrong. On the one hand, Muslim tradition is very much one of the African traditions. And second, it has involved in history a great deal of thinking and of knowledge, including, of course, knowledge of Islam, knowledge of the Quran, and knowledge of classical Islamic sources. So, the first step I take is to think of the ocean of stories that Muslims brought with them in their written tradition, but also in their folklore when they arrived in Africa. And how these stories somehow were used as a medium of communication and thinking that came to be shared by other communities beyond the Muslim community. And so, when I talk about Muslim orality, I'm not talking about codes, about stories, about symbols, which were kept exclusive to the Muslim community, but of something that the Muslim community had interest in communicating to others, and other communities were quite prepared to absorb and start using in creative ways of their own. But let us start with some nice slides. Well, this is African gold, wonderful Almoravid coins, which circulated in the Mediterranean and came to be called by Spanish names like Maravedi or Italian names like Marabutino. They were a very solid currency backed by a lot of gold, because Africa was America before America. It was a great source of gold for the economies around the Mediterranean. And not only the Muslim economies, the Christian economies, these coins circulated widely. So there is a comparison there between Africa and America. But there is a big difference, which is the African kings, chiefs, whatever titles they had, who controlled gold trade, did not suffer the same fate met to Montezuma of the Aztec or Atahualpa of the Inca, because no army came across the Sahara to impose a religion on these kings, which they did not know about before, and they retained their power. So when we think of trans-Saharan trade as gold trade, we have always to keep in mind the enormous difference between that kind of gold trade and the trade that developed later across the Atlantic after the conquistadores destroyed the pre-Columbian American empires. So for the gold trade to work, certain political and cultural arrangements had to be made in Africa, which were very different from what obtained in America about the European conquests. And Muslim orality is part of that. Muslim orality is one of the most powerful tools that made possible to create a workable model of trade in which African power continued to exist, and yet gold flowed in great quantities. A large number of the Muslim gold coins that survive are Almoravid coins. So much gold was available to this trade, so much gold was minted by this dynasty. So no conquistadores coming across the desert. And Muslims came to West Africa mostly as a result of private initiative, not after North African state initiatives. And they came against the recommendation of their own jurists, Maliki Muslim jurists in North Africa, considered blamable to go and trade in areas of the world where Islam was not the law of the land. What will happen if you die there? Your gold, your possessions will be divided in a way that is not according to Muslim law. And can you possibly maintain a Muslim style of life when living in those parts? So that was a problem which was circumvented by the private, mostly by the private interests of Muslim traders. It was a great triumph of private initiative over the timidity of the state, if you like. One thing Muslims brought across the Sahara was new ways of conceiving of the faraway spaces beyond the West African horizons. And Mecca was the center of that space. You have there a circle, an ideal circle, so that Muslim countries are not distributed between a center and a periphery. Everybody is equal around the circle. And of course, with south on the top and north at the bottom. And West Africa is at 1 and 2 o'clock. If you look carefully, you find there Ghana and Agadez and so on. And Takrur and Gaugao, of course. It is there, I promise you. But Mecca was not only a significant point in space. It was associated with the prophetic events at the beginning of Islam. So it was a reference point in time, in the times before the present. So one of the things that happened when Muslims came to West Africa is that Mecca was replicated in the region. People started describing particular commercial towns in West Africa as replicas of Mecca. Actually, at first it was Al-Dahost in the West, but then mainly Tadmekka in the East that were considered to be the image of Mecca transplanted to Africa. And as you can see from these lines, I'm quoting from one of the inscriptions there, there was a longing to have in Tadmekka, the name of which actually means Mecca is really here, verily here Mecca. Make Tadmekka a souk, a model, after a market, after the model of Mecca. And of course, with the presence of the Quran playing a central role there. In this very inscription, some of the phraseology is directly borrowed from the Quran. Now, in places like Al-Dahost, and especially Mecca, what you had was mostly or totally a permanent Muslim population. There were no other non-Muslim communities living side by side with the Muslims in Mecca. So Muslims were, so to speak, living among themselves. They did not have to cope with relations with communities that practiced a different religion or anything like that. That was not the situation further south. In cities like Gaugao and Kuchia and Ghana, which was somewhere there, you had actually a different situation in which Muslims were a minority community inserted in a much larger society where people practiced different cults and people followed ways totally different from the Muslim way. So to live there for a Muslim involved certain problems. You had to remain a Muslim with an identity which was clearly recognizable by other Muslims coming from North Africa, from the Middle East. Otherwise, the trans-Saharan trade would not work. These were diasporas of an international trade network, and to be a Muslim was to have membership in the network. So if you start mixing your Islam with other religions, you would lose this characteristic and it would stop. So how to do that then? There are descriptions. Let me see whether I have some. Well, to do that, we have to think about the way complex society originated in West Africa much before Islam came around. And I try to summarize a few points on these slides, thinking about what Roderick McIntosh says in his paper on the post model. The different groups come together, potential for conflict is diffused through the definition of strong corporate identities. It's not renouncing identity that creates a workable society. It is a contrary. Difference is important. Difference is essential. Demarcation of boundaries and, of course, mediation and social contracts between different groups. Now, a very important point is that for mediation to work, you must have symbolic idioms which are simultaneously accessible to different groups rather than exclusive to one group. And what I'm suggesting then is that when Muslims came around, Muslim idioms were made orally accessible to non-Muslims or appropriated by non-Muslims and served to create a shared medium. And it is this shared medium of symbols, repertoires, of ancestors, some of them virtuous ancestors, some of them villainous ancestors. It is through all this that society can work. So difference between identities must be maintained. But precisely from these differences, one can generate an intercommunal dynamics that makes the whole society work in a cohesive way, in a viable way. So that is the core of what I'm trying to say today about Muslim oralcy. When Muslims arrived in West Africa, Islamic knowledge was not taught in initiation societies. It was not surrounded by taboos that prevented access by other groups. So it was a type of knowledge which could circulate across the sharp boundaries that divided these different corporate identities. And one way then to generate cohesion, social cohesion, was to generate alternative stories of origins. Kings, royalty, or chiefdoms, and other institutions like, say, oral traditionists, the Oral Traditionist Corporation, who already had perfectly workable traditions of origin of their own, which had nothing to do with Islam, gradually developed alternative means of explanation of the origin and legitimacy of these institutions, including institutions which were obviously alien to Islam, like the secret societies. And the point was that it was in the interest of both Muslims and non-Muslims to maintain the sharp distinctness of the Muslim corporate identity, but keep communication going. Now, this sharp distinctness of the Muslim corporate identity was represented by the Muslims themselves with the help of a binary template which was in the Quran and which came from Mecca. There we have Mecca, Medina, and a number of other places like Haifa, Yemen, or Madain, the capital of these so-called Kisra kings, who played later an important role in West African traditions. All these stories came to West Africa brought by the Muslims. But in Mecca, at the time when Prophet Muhammad was revealing his message and acquiring a following, there was resistance. We don't have to go, of course, into the details of the history of this. So it was not simply a pressure that presented itself in violent or brutal ways. It was a pressure that was couched in persuasive language. Why be so absolute in what you say? Why not accept some kind of compromise? Why offend our gods? There are certain passages in the Quran that show Muslims being instructed by God to take a cautious attitude. Revile not the idols, revile not those they go beside Allah, lest they do the same, lest they revile Allah. So avoid that. And then, according to narratives, a group of prominent Meccans proposed to Muhammad something which was precisely a sharing of symbolic idioms. Let us worship what you worship, and you worship what we worship. We will combine in the matter. If what you worship is better, we'll take a share of it. If what we worship is better, you can take a share of that. So why not? Everybody will be happy, and all tension will disappear. So this is when this surah is revealed, which is totally uncompromising. Its final lines have a decisive tone. To you be your way, and to me mine. There is no possible compromise there. So the surah is above all a rejection of syncretism, and the establishment of an uncompromising difference between what Muslims are, what they believe in, the way they behave, and the way others do, everybody else. And no matter which, if you have different religions or if you consider yourself to differ in religion, you are all amalgamated in one block. It is a binary thing. It is Muslims and the other, an undifferentiated other. So it is totally uncompromising. It is difference, and there is in this Quranic text the slightest hint of cooperation or collaboration. There is nothing like that. However, when Prophet Muhammad and his Meccan followers moved to Medina, they are said to have established a pact between Muslims and non-Muslims, which originally included Jews. And there you are. These Jews were made into one community with believers. And to the Jews, their religion, and to the Muslims, their religion, their deen, their way of doing things. So there, it is, the surah is used in a different way. Now, this alliance did not work. It ended up in clashing and bloodshed. But with hindsight, certain commentators put forward the idea that maybe this pact never happened, that Ibn Ishaq, who related it, maybe was too influenced by Israeliyat, the stories Jewish converts brought into the Islamic tradition. On the other hand, many contemporary Muslim writers, on the contrary, say it happened and hail it as the first constitution to have granted freedom of religion ever. So we must take all this into account. In many cases, what is clear is that Ibn Ishaq and other writers and sections of Muslim audiences were quite prepared to believe that such a pact could have taken place. So this second meaning that can be seen in the words of Surah 109, Al-Kafirun, this second meaning must also be kept at the back of our mind when we think of West Africa. It is possible to suggest, and I am venturing to do it now, that that pact that did not work in Medina, that was so short-lived there, on the contrary, had something of a long history in West Africa. That in the background, both senses of the Surah Al-Kafirun were present in West African history. On the one hand, Muslims continue to be very aware of the need to make their identity sharply different from everybody else. On the other hand, aware of the possibility of coexisting with people of other religions. We can notice that even in the Covenant of Medina, Muslims do not renounce their specificity. They say to Muslims their religion, Jews their religion. It's possible to have one community made out of the two, but the two religions remain different. So, the binary templates which I'm maintaining Muslims brought to West Africa contained both these elements. Now, when we come to those cities I have talked about, Ghana, Kuchia, and Gaugao, the Arab writers who wrote about them in what we may call medieval centuries, though it is an inappropriate expression, I know, they describe those towns as twin towns. And I have tried to summarize the hesitations, the contradictions of these reports. The one by Al-Halabi, which is the second, says at the beginning, the king pretends to be a Muslim and most of his subjects do the same. But at the end, they say, the report says, they are all Muslims. And the king and his chief courtiers wear turbans. Because it was difficult for Arab writers collecting information from Arab traders to come to grips with the difficult dialectic of communal relationships that operated in West Africa. And kings, one important point is that both Muslims and the other side, the kings and the votaries of African traditional religions, in order for their association to work, had to make mutual adjustments, linguistic adjustments, political adjustments, cultural adjustments. In the report about Ghana, when near the end, there is a sentence that says, those who profess the same religion as the king fall on their knees before him and sprinkle dust on their heads. But the Muslims greet him only by clapping their hands. Now, this may seem at first a very small matter, but it is actually an enormous concession made by the ceremonial of African courts. Everybody was supposed to prostrate before the king. But since Muslims are supposed to prostrate only before God, then the adjustment was made. Kings desisted from their rights to make everybody prostrate and accepted that Muslims would not prostrate, would just clap their hands. There was another side to it, which was if a king wants to partake in Muslim prayers, what will he do? Because a king is not supposed to prostrate before anybody. The kingship invested in the king's body is not compatible with this. So we have interesting cases like the great conqueror Sonyali of Songhai, which would pray, but sitting down. He would try to, and as long as he was powerful, this went on because he just did it. But it is a way of an adjustment. Both sides trying to adjust. The Muslims who lived in Kuchia, they tolerated the behavior of Sonyali. In Kuchia, there are inscriptions that show that there was a wazir, a Muslim minister, working at the time of the Sony dynasty, a khatib, a Friday prayer officer who does the Friday sermon, the Islamic Friday sermon. And that is the moment in which Friday, when the Muslims express recognition of the political power in the area they are living. So Muslims, if they had a khatib in Kuchia at the time of the Sunni, they certainly expressed recognition of this dynasty power, even though they did not pray in the correct way. So sometimes concessions had to be made. But most of the time, Muslims adhered, especially in their own behavior, to their distinct identity, which they would not surrender. And there was no enormous pressure on them to do otherwise. Why? Because West African society was quite used to differences. Different communes behaved in very different ways. They had different cultural practices. And that was a normal thing in a normal society. So you don't have to say, stop doing this, Muslims, do as everybody else. Because there was nothing like that, doing like everybody else does. Each group did its own thing. Now, there was also a kind of complicity. These reports show very clearly the importance of the relationship between kings and Muslims. And there was a kind of complicity of symbolic idioms between these two agencies. A widespread story of origins of political power in West Africa contrasted lineages that owned the land, mastered all the earth, people who were autochthonous or who had occupied that land first. And because of that, they enjoyed an important ritual role. And contrasted to that, dynasties of conquerors who had come from elsewhere and seized political power. So you had Amzel, in a well-cited, deservedly well-cited work, calls this a binary ideology, a scheme for thinking out political power, which creates a polarity in which each pole is indispensable to the other. If the scheme is to work, both poles must be there. There is no point in one pole trying to eliminate the other. It is again a very typical kind of West African arrangement. Now, two binary templates, the royal template and the Muslim template. But when Muslims come into the sphere of influence of these kings, they become a sort of third element, which immediately increases the symbolic capital available to kings and increases royal power, because kings now can claim to be natural mediators between two poles, which are Muslims on the one hand and the ritual people who take care of the rituals of the earth on the other. It gives kings a much greater independence, symbolic independence, than they had before. Another great advantage for kings was the Islamic calendar. The Islamic calendar made it possible to reshape the calendar of ritual festivals, separating. It is not the Islamic calendar is not seasonal. It doesn't obey the solar seasons. The months move across the seasons. So kings, if they timed their royal festivals according to the Islamic calendar, which they did in Mamprugo, which they did in Bogu, and which they did in a lot of other places, they could have festivals of their own which are well distinguished from the old seasonal festivals linked to the Earth's ritual masters. So that is another advantage. Other institutions also benefited from the arrival of Muslims. I'm trying to list the reasons certain West African groups which did not have a Muslim tradition, the reasons they had to welcome the presence of Muslims. Oral traditionists. Oral traditionists were in the Gramscian sense, the organic intellectuals of the Keita Empire. They produced the social consensus that made people accept that the normal way of society to exist was to be governed by the Keita, which is a very natural and nice thing to happen. And if Muslims are present, oral traditionists must be able, as far as they can, to include Muslims in this consensus. So they must acquaint themselves with a degree of Islamic knowledge. The Muslims don't seem to have been at all discontent at that. It seems that Muslims collaborated in the same way as Muslim tradition and royal traditions developed a complicity. Muslim tradition and griot tradition developed a complicity. We see that in the fact that was studied by people like Hugo Zenk, Jan Janssen, and Barbara Hoffman, of the parallel stories of origin that griots created for themselves. They had, of course, other stories, but now they gave themselves parallel narratives in which their ancestor was a man called Surakata. This Surakata, if you go into Muslim sources, you can trace this story to a figure called Suraka bin Malik, who was actually, in the Muslim stories, a very minor figure in Mecca. Now, for such a marginal figure to come to play eventually such an important role as ancestor of oral traditionists in West Africa, you can only imagine that there was a deliberate effort by Muslims to insert that personage in the stories that were told in West Africa. So there is again a complicity there, and griots and Muslims work in the same direction because it is in their mutual interest to do so. And the final bonus for griots was that griots are supposed to be masters of knowledge. Now, if I am a master of knowledge, I must master all knowledges, including Muslim knowledge, if it happens to come around. So griots had to import this. And Mamadou Diawara, who is sitting there, has shown in his work the points of contact and the mechanism of contact between oral traditionists and even Muslim literati And so oral traditionists could sometimes access even the written Muslim tradition. So all this goes in the direction of generating this shared medium of communication I have been trying to talk about. Now, one very interesting story which I discussed in a publication some years ago is these visits by a figure called Makantajiri to Mecca. Mecca is a dual Mecca at the time when half of it was Muslim, half of it was not Muslim. So it is a flashback to the days before the Hijrah. But the division that existed then is frozen in time, and it is possible to visit the two parts. So he goes there, the Prophet sees him, he tells the Prophet he wants to know about Islam, and the Prophet instantly injects into him total knowledge of the Quran. All very good. But later, he decides to visit the non-Muslim part of Mecca. And there he's shown the sacred objects linked to the Congo and other secret societies. So he goes back and says he no longer wants to be a Muslim. The Prophet is not disturbed by that. He just removes all Islamic knowledge from him, and Makantajiri returns to them again with the sacred objects. One point which is interesting to pay attention to is that there is no mixing. Makantajiri doesn't want to have at the same time Muslim knowledge and knowledge of the Congo. It has to be either or. So these stories are not a surrender of Congo tradition to Muslim tradition. They are again, once again, in a parallel idiom, affirming the distinct identity of Congo and its importance, its illustrious origin, etc. So that is how these things work. Now, all that may appear to change at the time of the great jihad movements of the 18th and 19th century. And there is somewhere here, let me see. This is Busa, a city I'm going to talk about again, Miki, and this is New Yoyo, but Oyoyo is a little further up there. Now, from the very core of the jihad tradition, we have confirmation of the use of Surah al-Kafirun as a device to guide Muslims in their coexistence with non-Muslims. There we have Abdullah bin Fodder, and who says, this was written, these particular lines, just before the beginning of the jihad. Even though we are living among the kuffar, even the land belongs to them, not to us, we did not mix with them. And using the root, an Arabic root, that also served later, or at the same time, to create the name Mukhalitun, mixers given in jihadi literature to those who combine Islamic and non-Islamic practices. So there you have again, there you have what seems to be a return to an understanding of Surah 109, which is all about separation and which contains no allusion to cooperation. It's just difference. just distinction. However, if we look at the proclamation which was made before the Sokoto Jihad by Nafata, king of Gobir, you see an attempt to restore the older balance where distinct religious political spheres coexisted. And in order to do that, to force the new style Muslim community now turning to the jihad, to give up their new identity markers, and yet to compromise with Sheikh Usman Danfodio. So it's not about abolishing Islam at all. It is about keeping Islam together with the other sphere. No son should convert away from his father's religion. And if you have converted, you must go back. And you cannot wear a turban or a veil. But Sheikh Usman Danfodio is still allowed to preach. This was a doomed attempt, you know very well. And, but this is how I am presenting it. I and Moraes lament the fact that our old friend Abdullah Smith is not here at the moment to show me the error of my ways. And I want to acknowledge that in the title of this lecture, I actually borrowed from the title of his pioneer paper on jihad movements. But betraying him is my way of following on his footsteps, of trying to... Now, 100 years after Abdullah Danfodio wrote those lines, an unbearable situation developed for the Sokoto intelligentsia, the British conquest. And the Caliph had attempted a hijrah, but it was doomed, it was impossible to do it. And he is killed in battle and so. But the Wazir decides to consult the Alkali of Gwandu, who provides his opinion. And he says, dwelling and having social intercourse with the kuffar is not unbelief. And if it is done for their guidance, how could it be unbelief as long as the Muslim inhabitant doesn't become an unbeliever? And surely this has happened for so many years before and after the time of the Sheikh and his brother. And then it goes back to quote the lines written by Abdullah Danfodio. So what we have there is once again the use of this surah as something that opens up a space for living together and for a degree of cooperation that in this case is supposed not to be excessive because it is cooperation between the local people and the conquerors, the colonial conquerors. But it is there. It is not simply emphasis on separation. It is say we had social intercourse with them, and this is how it was. Now, this is a map which was given by Clapperton to Mohammed Bello, and Camille Lefebvre has discussed it very well in her work. And there we see again here is Bangu, Niki, here is Busa, and if you come down south, you find Old Oyo. Now, the old geographers' idea that the Nile and the Niger were the same river generated the notion that Egyptian pharaonic paganism could have come to West Africa along the Niger. The Timbuktu literature mentions or suggests that Kuchia was a place associated with the sorcerers that Pharaoh mobilized against Prophet Moses. And in this polemic against Bornu, Muhammad Bello says that the people of Bornu behaved towards the river as the Copts in the time of Jahiliyyah behaved towards the Nile. But what I'm talking about now is not this. It is the Nile, the Niger, described in oral stories as actually a barrier between West and East, between Mecca on the east and of course Sokoto in the east and the north, with political arrangements totally geared to Islam, and on the other side of the divide, much more complex political arrangements in which different groups coexisted and so on. This is a story widely known, collected by Samuel Johnson from the traditionists of Oyo, from the Arakan. And it is about the famous lineage of Namrudu, Nimrod, of course, of the Bible, and the Nimrud of the Islamic tradition. And his son, Oduduwa, is forced to leave Mecca by the Muslims and establish himself at Ile-Ife. There, his descendants worship an Orisha, but also a copy of the Quran. In this case, the Quran is deprived of its verbal function. It is treated as if it were a non-verbal thing, as an object to be worshipped. But still, it is the two entities, one of the two entities that Oduduwa must keep within his religion. Eventually, Oduduwa's son, Orania, decides to wage war on Mecca, but for several reasons, he is unable to cross the Niger and has to abandon the project. Now, he decides it would be shameful to return to Ile-Ife. So, following the advice of Abobu King, he builds a new capital, Ojo Aka, which is Oyo Ile. And this is, in many ways, a typical royal story. It establishes the independence of the Oyo dynasty in relation to Ile-Ife, the place, the center of traditions of autochthonous origin of the Yoruba, much older traditions and so on. But it is also a case in which traditions couched in the Muslim idiom are made official at the court. And this is an interesting characteristic of most of the stories of the Arakan, or a large number of Arakan stories we know about. You don't have a kind of 50-50 division between non-Muslim stories and Muslim stories. Many of the most important stories are actually in Muslim idiom. So why would the Alafinate courts display a preference for stories in Muslim idiom instead of much older stories which gave their legitimacy a totally different origin that had nothing to do with Islam? This is one of the interesting points that needs further investigation, but it could be suggested that at that point in history, the Muslim stories had, across society at large, a higher degree of intertranslatability. They are more intertranslatable than other stories. The fact is that they are official stories of the court of the Alphabet. I'm almost at the end, and now this is a story about Bursa itself and about a famous ritual that took place there every year. The Niger supposedly had been a narrow stream, but was miraculously enlarged by Kisra to deny passage to the Muslim army that was following them, he and his party. Or alternatively, it was Prophet Muhammad that decided to establish a barrier to separate this Israel and these people from proper Muslims. But the barrier was there, and Bursa kings were not allowed to sail on the Niger or cross it. Some even say they shouldn't drink water from the Niger. And every year, at the time of one of the great Muslim festivals, the greatest of all, the king of Bursa prayed. He went to the praying ground and prayed with the Muslim, which was a great concession for the reasons I have told already of kings not prostrating, etc. Even in the 80s and 90s, 1990, 1980s, it was very interesting. In Bogu, I saw that Muslims were allowed, contrary to most other people, to come before the king without prostration. Nobody demanded prostration from them. But kings, even if they had converted to Islam before installation, they shouldn't pray, because a king is not supposed to prostrate. It is against the very condition of kingship. But in this case, the king of Bursa prayed. There were different solutions in different cultural contexts to these problems. But then he would take a spear in his hand and gallop around asking where was the man who caused him to pray. And now he was going to stop that and wage war on Islam. Except that this was repeated absolutely every year. So in a way, it has a similarity with the story of Makan Tajdi in Mecca. It is either or. The king moves from acceptance to rejection of Islam. But it is not both things. It's not claiming to be both Muslim and non-Muslim. He is Muslim and then he goes to the other side. And in the time succession, he would become a Muslim again, of course, and reject Islam once more in da capo. So, to call this mixing, I think, might be missing its point entirely. It is something else. It is a symbolic game in which absolutely different, sharply different identities must be preserved, but moves between them operate sometimes, become possible. But there is no missing, no mixing. And this is where I rest my case.